The conversation about Christian metal has always fascinated me simply because at face value, it sounds like such an oxymoron, considering the fact that most people, how they associate lyrical themes with metal music is anything but religious. As more often than not, you'll find lyrical themes that have to do with death, war, Armageddon, or it's very grotesque, violent, and gory with its album artwork. And obviously you'll find a lot of themes that are very anti-religious, as Satanism is brought up more often than not when it comes to what bands use for their lyrical themes. And regardless of what time period you look at metal music, from decades ago, from the whole Satanic Panic to even present day, you'll always find those themes brought up over and over again, whether it's the new bands to the legacy acts, from their album artwork to their band names. It's always had this strong presentation of anti-religious lyrical themes that it would almost seem impossible for Christianity's influences and values to be weaved into metal music. Yet, what's really interesting is not only has Christian themes been integrated into metal's music and subculture, but it's been integrated a lot deeper than I think people have realized throughout the years. Now, one can argue a reason as to why this is since metal music is so affiliated and looked upon as it's very anti-religious with its lyrical themes and presentation, that if some individuals are trying to start a metal band with pro-Christian views, you could view it as they are a rebellion against the rebellion, is one way of putting it, which is totally valid. And with some of the bands I'll be talking about in this video, yeah, that is some of their stances here. However, what I think really kind of started religious and Christian types of values and themes into metal music is, simply put, Christianity is, one of the biggest religions in the world, and its influences stretch all across the globe. Let me also remind you, what's heavily tied to Christianity, of course, is the Bible. Now, regardless of how you view the Bible, if you have faith in it and you believe in it or you don't, end of the day, what I'm trying to bring up here is the Bible, as you can clearly see, is a book. Pages, words, sentences, phrases, stories here. What it basically is, it's literature. It's a form of art. And literature can be adapted and inspired and take influence in all different ways limitlessly, from movies, video games, and of course in this case, music. And since the Bible is a form of literature, I do feel like some of the earliest bands are associated with metal and hard rock, as we stretch it all the way back to the 70s. They viewed the Bible as a form of literature to take inspiration for lyrical themes or songs that they could write, and kind of viewed it as more of like a blueprint for what they could do musically and lyrically. Speaking of which, what I find just so ironic that goes over a lot of people's heads is that when it comes to Christian themes being tied into metal music, one of the earliest examples that we can find of it would come from none other than the godfathers themselves of metal, Black Sabbath, with their 1971 full-length album, Master of Reality. You could argue right here with this album that Black Sabbath wrote one of the, if not the very first Christian metal song, as a lot of people view Black Sabbath as the first metal band. Look at the second track on this album, After Forever, and look at the closing verse of that song that goes, "Perhaps you'll think before you say that God is dead and gone, open your eyes, just realize that He's the one who can save you now from all this sin and hate, or will you just steal, jeer at all you hear? Yes, I think it's too late." Religion has always been a theme when it comes to Black Sabbath with some of their lyrics, that when it comes to their dark, brooding sound, it's not so much done in the sense of trying to be evil to shock people because they're satanic. It's nothing like that. If anything, what they're trying to represent with their sound and lyrical themes when it comes to their religious songs and ideas is it's more of a warning, it's more of a narrative that some of the evils that would come from Satanism, what that could represent or at least sound like musically, is what Black Sabbath gives off. Same thing when it comes to like a film from decades ago, like for example The Omen, that it's not being pro-satanic, it's just showcasing to you the evils that come from, Satanism and more of like a narrative sense. Black Sabbath is like that, but as a band. However, even though Black Sabbath uses religion as a theme for some of their songs, this doesn't mean that they are a Christian metal band. And this is where now within the conversation of this, I feel like there's two different types of Christian metal that we can refer to here. The first kind of Christian metal I'm using quite loosely here because it's just like what I talked about with Black Sabbath. It's a metal band that consists of members that their own individual religious beliefs, they don't share the same faith or the values of Christianity, but they'll use either references or inspiration of the Christian faith for some of their lyrical themes when it comes to some of their songwriting. So while they're not Christian metal when it comes to their own beliefs, we can loosely tag it with Christian metal because it still carries over the lyrical themes and ideas being represented, whether it be just a quick reference to an overall narrative. The other kind of Christian metal is where they go full force with it, where it's a metal band consisting of band members who actually believe in the faith of Christianity and bring over those values and ideas onto their music, whether it be their lyrical themes, presentation, and album artwork. It's all connected to their own personal faith. From what I was able to find, what is considered to be the first Christian band that's not in the style of heavy metal but quite close and adjacent to it would be the Swedish hard rock band called Jerusalem, who formed back in 1975, and a few years later in 1978 they would release their debut self-titled full-length album that, even though it's in the style of hard rock music, we need to consider the fact that this is the 70s. During this time, metal music, at least as we know it, is still in its infancy. It's nothing that, expanded upon yet as how we know of it being whether extreme or going in all different branches and directions. It's still in its infancy as, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, those bands and legacy acts are still trying to get on their feet and stand up. And when it comes to hard rock music, this was pretty heavy for its time. Now, Jerusalem just kind of plays it quite standard and safe, but it's interesting to just hear something like this when it comes to the origins of Christian bands being formed here. And they're quite on the nose with it, considering the fact that all the members believe in the Christian faith, and some of these song titles are quite on the nose with the lyrical themes. Examples of it could come from the second track called Jesus the Most Fantastic, to one of the closing tracks on here called What If Jesus Is Right. It would only be a few years later, until the late 70s and early 80s, where more Christian bands would come forth. And as metal was evolving, I think a lot of Christian musicians were adapting to it. And I would say roughly around the late 70s is where we would get the first true example of Christian metal coming into fruition. The band in question that's considered to be the first ever example of Christian heavy metal would be a band that formed in Los Angeles, California back in 1977 called Barnabas. And when you listen to their debut full-length album from 1980 called Hear the Light, just from the opening track on here called Savior, it's really, really obvious and apparent as to where their faith lies. As the opening title suggests, titled Savior, they're obviously referring to Jesus Christ as their Savior. And as you listen to that song verse by verse, and the songs after it track by track, they never deviate away from the Christian themes on this album. That overall, it's a pretty fun listen, as it's a mixture between early 80s heavy metal meets hard rock influences. So a lot of the guitar riffs have that rock and roll flair to it that's quite fun. There's a lot of hooks with the melodies. The bass playing on here has a lot of groove. The drumming's really solid. The standout feature about this would be the vocal performance done by Nancy Jo Mann. She absolutely kills it on here. There's a lot of power with her presentation and execution that it just demands your attention, and you can clearly hear all of her verses having references and inspiration from, Christianity and its faith. That it's a really interesting listen when you apply it to the context with this topic, obviously. That when it comes to the first ever fully pledged Christian heavy metal band, this is it. Barnabas would end up releasing a couple more albums after, but call it quits in 1986. only having a 9-year run. They would try to reform in 1993, but nothing came of it as band members couldn't agree on terms, and they kind of faded into obscurity. While they are kind of easy to come across if you're primarily looking for the earliest examples of Christian heavy metal, for the most part they're kind of sidelined, and that has to do with the fact that they had a short run, and during this time of the 80s there were other Christian metal bands making much bigger waves. That of course now leading into the conversation for Stryper. Yes, the Yellow Black Attack, otherwise known as Salvation Through Redemption, yielding peace, encouragement, and righteousness. Or to just save my breath here, Stryper. Although they are not the first Christian heavy metal band, when the conversation is brought up of Christian heavy metal, they are absolutely the first band most people think of. In my personal view, Stryper was the original rebellion against the rebellion when it comes to the whole satanic panic that was going on in the 80s, as when it comes to their overall just image and appearance, it mirrors a lot of what heavy metal bands were doing during this time, but just applying a very strong pro-Christian view and faith here. As a lot of metal bands would dress in dark clothing, Stryper did the same, only with the contrast now of yellow, really standing out a lot more, to their posing on some of their album artworks, to their overall band logo. It's really bold and just sticks out like a sore thumb. That's really eye-appealing. To their sound. Their sound overall, at least when it comes to the guitar riffs, it has that very kind of like sleazy heavy metal sound, something similar to like Dokken or Wasp, but instead of the lyrical themes being about getting with women, their lyrical themes now obviously have to do with Christianity. During the mid and late 80s, Stryper would end up finding a lot of commercial success, as all three of the albums during that time period charted on the Billboard 200 and really peaked quite high on the Christian music chart. And really what struck with a lot of people is it has the sound and image of traditional heavy metal of that time that's powerful yet really sleazy, but Michael Sweet's vocals and his lyrical themes can be quite angelic at times, but also very powerful, as it is still quite really on the nose with its Christian values. It's not leaving really any stretch of the imagination of what it's trying to interpret here. Just the overall musicianship and songwriting was extremely solid, that I know this is just preaching to the choir here. If you really want to get an idea of what Christian metal is at its most bare bones, straightforward approach, the first three Stryper albums are that. But on a more personal note, I remember being maybe in elementary school and my dad showed me Stryper, and I think his personal favorite at that time was their second full-length album, To Hell with the Devil. Again, another really on the nose album title with its lyrical themes that, again, it doesn't leave much room to the imagination of where Stryper is with their faith. But a lot of it kind of leans into like that either dad rock type of songwriting that's really straightforward, to more of like these anthemic rock anthems that is straightforward and basic as it is. It gets drilled into your head and they're quite catchy tunes. But I would say my personal favorite Stryper album would be their third full-length album, In God We Trust, where they just hone in more with the whole anthemic Christian stadium rock, stadium metal sound, that it kind of leans into glam metal at some points, that it's basically, what if Motley Crue became Christians, is what this album always reminded me of. And as basic and simplistic as it is for like radio-friendly heavy metal music, just the songwriting is just great. It's fun to listen to, whether it be Calling on You to the title track on here, In God We Trust. I've always found Michael Sweet's vocal performance during this particular time period to be his strongest. I always found the guitar riffs to kind of lean into power metal territory, especially when it comes to some of the guitar solos on this album. That overall, I've just always found Stryper to just be a very good heavy metal band, regardless if I'm trying to interpret, as basic as they are, the Christian themes or not. Clearly, when it came to commercial success, Stryper stood head and shoulders above everyone else. But let it be known, Stryper was just one of the many hard rock and heavy metal bands forming during this time in the 80s. Other noteworthy names would be Leviticus, Barren Cross, Saint, and Bride. Again, all playing in that style of a mixture between traditional heavy metal and hard rock with a strong emphasis of preaching of the Christian faith. I'm sure to any of the metal enthusiasts watching this, that when it comes to the evolution of metal music as we progress onwards from the early 80s up until the mid 80s, metal music was taking a different approach now, from traditional heavy metal and forms of hard rock to a more upbeat and heavier take with forms of hardcore punk being influenced, and this is where thrash metal started becoming a thing. It's important to note here that when I'm referring to the topic of Christian metal, that means all different forms of metal, all the different subgenres and branches off of heavy metal music, that there's so many out there to name. And then when it came to thrash metal, Christian themes, or at least musicians that were obviously Christian, were adapting to the evolution of metal during their time, and there was even Christian thrash metal, believe it or not. A great example of this would be a band called Vengeance, who later on changed their name to Vengeance Rising because another band already had that name, with their 1988 full-length album, Human Sacrifice. Man, all I gotta say with this album is that it's an absolute face melter from start to finish. Playing the style of thrash metal with the guitar riffs playing so blisteringly fast, to the vocal performance that has like these wretched snarls, to these bellowing yells at certain points with some of the variations the vocalist does, to the drumming on here that's played with just such intensity and velocity, that even though they're from Los Angeles, California, really what this album reminded me of more musically is some of the speed and thrash metal bands coming out of Canada, like Exciter and Razor, only now they're a bit more enlightened with some of the lyrical verses if you pay attention to it. But just overall, as I stated, it's a face melter. It's also worth mentioning the band Deliverance, that was also from Los Angeles, California, playing in the style of thrash metal around the same time of the mid and late 80s, that shared members with Vengeance Rising, so clearly the influence and inspiration was there. The difference between Deliverance, however, is it's still in the style again of thrash and forms of speed metal, but it's not as intense as Vengeance Rising, at least with Human Sacrifice, putting a little bit more aspects into traditional heavy metal, at least when it came to the vocal approach, that it kind of reminded me a little bit more of Anthrax or Overkill with how they were doing some of their songwriting. Still just as good and definitely worth checking out, as again, the songwriting and ideas are quite similar as they shared members. But if you're looking for more of an oddball when it comes to Christian thrash metal, which I mean, it's kind of an oddball within itself, but in terms of at least songwriting approach, then I would recommend this band from Pennsylvania called Believer, with their second full-length album from 1990, Sanity Obscure, that is more in the style now of progressive and technical metal and thrash metal being implemented with their songwriting, that everything's a bit more jagged and different, but still maintains that intense sound you would want with a metal band. One way of describing it is it sounds a lot similar to what Coroner was doing during this time, that if you're a fan of Coroner to more of the unorthodox approach of something like Voivod, this will definitely appeal to you. Moving on into the timeline, focusing now on late 80s and early 90s, metal was finding itself to be even more extreme than ever before, starting from traditional hard rock to the mid 80s having more of a thrash metal sound, to now in the late 80s and early 90s, death metal was coming into fruition. And while death metal is obviously dominated by more bands that have anti-religious themes, during the same time period, there were small little pockets popping here and there of death metal bands having a more pro-Christian and pro-religious themes with their sound. From my knowledge, one of the earliest examples of a death metal band implementing these lyrical themes would be Incubus with their 1988 full-length album, Serpent Temptation. It goes without saying, but this is an excellent death metal album that I know at face value, at least when you look at the song titles and even album artwork, you would think it has more to do with Armageddon or humanity's downfall, which, yeah, a lot of these like evil themes are being presented here. However, what they're doing, when you really read through the lyrics, it's more of like a criticism towards Satanism itself. So while the themes are evil, it's more of a narrative, it's more of a warning to, you know, the devil's temptation to what it does to mankind, or mankind's overall greed when they, you know, give in to sin. So it's Christians making death metal more of like this preacher type of warning to the audience when you really read into the lyrics. But again, in terms of songwriting and overall musicianship, it's excellent death thrash that I feel like anyone who is a death metal fan will fall in love with it musically. Then of course there's Mortification, an Australian death metal band that formed back in 1990. And I would state that their first 4 albums are excellent pieces of death metal overall. It's just obviously they're included here because their lyrical themes are heavily tied to Christianity. But I would strongly recommend checking out their second full-length album, Scrolls of the Megillith. Not only is this just heavy, aggressive death metal, but what I find really interesting about Mortification lyrically is it's more than just being Christian, praising the Lord, and they want to be in heaven, but more so that lyrically it's a lot more aggressive when you read along with it. And I feel like that has to do with the fact that the members of Mortification are kind of self-aware of like how heavy and aggressive they're playing, that what they're being aggressive towards is, you know, forms of evil and Satanism, as if they're ready to fight the devil itself with how this music's being played. That one way I could describe Mortification is, at least lyrically anyway, and the overall vibe of them, is think of deicide, but instead of attacking Jesus, they're attacking the devil. I gotta admit, as I was doing research for this video, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that there's a lot more Christian death metal bands out there that I was unaware of. One that I recently came across only a few days ago is this Norwegian technical death metal band, out of all things, called X-Toll, with their debut full-length album from 1998 titled Burial. This album runs for a little over an hour long, but goddamn, when I was done listening to it, I still wanted more. It's technical death metal, as I stated, but one way of putting it is it kind of reminds me a little bit of Necrophagus, or Necrophagus, however you say it, that it's technical, but it doesn't go off the rails as hard as Necrophagus, because it bounces back and forth between like technical death metal and straightforward death metal at times. So it kind of makes each portion kind of shine a little bit brighter and stand out more. But overall, lyrically, as you can imagine with this video, it has everything I've been talking about thus far. But again, just like with Mortification, there's a bit more aggression with it, showcasing a little bit of a battle between, you know, heaven and hell is kind of what's going on here, but they're just rooting for heaven, basically, is how it's presented with their overall vibe and lyrical verses. But honest to God, seriously, this really surprised me. That I'm not the biggest fan of technical death metal, but this is just really, really well written stuff overall musically. Whether you like technical death metal or not, I can't help but feel like if you're just a fan of extreme music, you can't help but admire the musicianship that goes on with this album from start to finish. Other noteworthy names here that were death metal bands blending together other forms of extreme metal would be Paramecium, a death doom band that had a lot of gothic influences tied to their sound. Then you have Living Sacrifice, an excellent Christian death thrash band. And believe it or not, there's a band called Vomitorial Corpulence, which is a Christian gore grind band that if you ever wondered what Carcass would sound like if they were Christians, here you go. Probably the most eye-opening for most is that, believe it or not, black metal even adapted to Christian themes, otherwise known as Unblack metal. When it comes to the term of unblack metal, really all that's showcasing is it's still black metal musically, but the lyrical themes that we are accustomed to hearing with black metal, you know, of like anti-Christian, church burnings, and anti-religion of all kind, that's just turned on its head, and now we're being pro-Christian, which is just so against the norm of just the whole mentality of what black metal was all about, especially when it comes to the whole Norwegian black metal scene. What's often cited for being the spearhead harbinger for unblack metal would be a band from Norway, believe it or not, that being Antestor. When you listen to their first handful of releases from the mid and late 90s, Antestor is more in vein now of death metal and doom metal a lot slower. The only thing black metal about them, if we're really splitting hairs, is it has a little bit more of that rawness and atmospheric approach, and that's really it. It wouldn't be until 2005 with their third full-length album where they would hit a little bit more of a positive reception from fans, that being their album, The Forsaken. This is where the whole unblack metal, Christian black metal sound and image really comes to its highlight here. Having a little bit more of a symphonic element that I know this is kind of cliche to compare to reminds me a little bit of Emperor, but it has more of like this angelic effect with it and not so much of an urgent side that Emperor kind of did. And what's really interesting and surprising about this is that the guest drumming on this album is Hellhammer from Mayhem. Overall, it's an excellent album that I can definitely see the appeal for, and I can understand as to why it has a lot of positive reviews. But just overall, if you're wondering what unblack metal or Christian black metal is, this is a perfect representation of what it's capable of doing. Oh, and it's also worth mentioning that Antestor, during their time being an unblack metal in Norway during the 90s, is that supposedly they were getting death threats from Euronymous, Varg, and Faust from Emperor to hopefully make them disband, as they were so against the grain of what the norm was for black metal of their time. It's just that never happened because, as you know, Varg ended up murdering Euronymous and things went to hell. Another really early example of Christian black metal, or unblack metal in this case, would come from Australia, a one-man black metal project called Horde. Back in 1994, they would release their sole full-length album, Helig Esfart, which is Norwegian and it translates to English, that being Holy Unblack. Musically, there's not much to state with Horde. It's just really stripped down black metal. The standout thing about them is obviously it's against the grain lyrically of what black metal is all about, as it's all pro-Christian themes with each song title. One that really stands out to me would be the song titled Invert the Inverted Cross, which I know sounds corny, which, let's be real, the song title is, but I'll be honest, that song bangs. It's simplistic, straightforward, vicious black metal, and that's all this album is, and honestly that's all it needs to be for it to stand out, because again, for 1994 standards for lyrical themes with black metal, this was so against the grain. It's also really interesting to note with Horde that 13 years later in 2007, they would do their first and only live performance, out of all places, in Oslo, Norway, which the performance is really kick-ass. You can watch the whole thing here on YouTube. And again, it just seemed like the whole purpose of this was either it was kind of like trolling the whole Norwegian black metal scene, or this individual that supposedly is anonymous, that no one really knows who he is, really believed this. Regardless, just overall, it's just interesting to see something like this with this caliber, this songwriting, this execution that just sounds like every other black metal band, lyrically just be the polar opposite. Moving back over to the Scandinavian countries, another band worth mentioning here would be Crimson Moonlight. Started off more in the sense of a symphonic black metal band utilizing keyboards with their demos, but ended up abandoning that for more of a straightforward approach with black metal with their full-length albums that tends to lead more into like melodic black death metal territory, something really similar to that of like Necrophobic or Dissection. And while this band is doing absolutely nothing new, it's not reinventing the wheel for black metal or unblack metal, just overall, it's just really, really well written, aggressive black metal. Vicious vocals, pummeling drums, blast beats galore with it, to tremolo pick guitars that's really, vicious and infectious at the same time. Just overall, very well written stuff that is definitely worth the mention here. And that's the thing with most of these bands I was coming across labeled under unblack metal. Really all they're doing musically is everything you're already used to hearing. The standout features about them being lyrically and album artwork wise anyway, it's the total opposite of what you're used to hearing, as it's not Satanism anymore, it's very pro-religious. But bands worth mentioning that, again, it's nothing groundbreaking but overall really solid stuff for this topic would be stuff like Langseal, Select Volk, and Belia, which are from Indonesia out of all places. That being said, one unblack metal band that really stood out to me musically because of how much it experimented during the whole unblack metal scene of the 90s would be, once again, another band from Indonesia out of all places, that being Kekal, with their 1998 full-length album, Beyond the Glimpse of Dreams. Another lengthy album that clocks in a little over an hour long. And while it has all the components you would want in black metal, what makes it such a standout is there's portions throughout the whole album that it experiments a bit, utilizing keyboards and synthesizers. Not in the sense of any kind of like symphonic type of approach or something similar to Burzum, but more so having to do with keyboards being almost like a backdrop throughout it. Different tempos, different ambiences and atmospheres transitioning in and out, that it feels a lot more spiritual in a sense. Add to the fact there's a lot of guest session vocalists of different women singing over this, that adds a little bit more of an angelic type of sensation with it. That overall, in terms of composition, songwriting, transitions, and just the flow of the album, it feels just a little bit more of a shakeup. There's a sense of like enlightenment throughout the album. And what's surprising with Kekal is all of their albums before and after this have this kind of type of experimentation going on, just a lot more components with it, that if you're looking to broaden the horizons of just black metal overall, not just unblack metal in this case, this band is definitely worth checking out if you're looking for stuff like outside the box. But with all that stated of extreme metal bands adding in forms of Christianity into their lyrical themes of the 80s and 90s, when we cross over into the 2000s, I would say at this point when it came to Christian heavy music or Christian heavy metal, that it would hit an absolutely new peak in terms of popularity. Because at this point now, metalcore and deathcore bands are starting to become the new hot trendy thing, and a lot of those bands, looking back on it on retrospect, had either Christian themes or references, or all outright just Christian metalcore or Christian deathcore bands. What's often considered as one of the earliest examples of Christian metalcore would be from the band Zao, with their 1996 debut full-length album, All Else Failed. Zao has always been, at least from the start, a Christian metalcore band, as all the members shared that faith. But as albums went on and there was band lineup changes, Christianity was slowly being diminished from their lyrical themes. But make no mistake about it, with their early releases, Christianity was front and center with a lot of their themes. And with their debut full-length album from 1996, it's metalcore with other forms kind of shaken up, playing between both metal and hardcore back and forth, with some songs having more of a hardcore approach, other songs kind of leaning into that metallic hardcore style that kind of gets into something similar to that of Integrity almost. The production value is really rough around the edges, but it's very emotive and it kind of works for its charm. Overall, from what my understanding is with Zao, from after listening to this album, is that they're one of the more respected and early examples of metalcore, at least with the overall genre, that if you want a good understanding of what metalcore is in a more rough around the edges sense, definitely check this album out. However, with that being said, I don't think Zao really was the call before the storm of Christianity finding its way into metalcore, as I think what really kind of led to Christianity finding its way into metalcore a lot is now we're having a whole new generation of bands coming forth now. As again, a lot of these bands were forming around either the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and late 2000s, that from my understanding from reports that I've seen, at least 42% of Americans were attending church during this time. And considering the fact that church culture kind of leans into like using music in terms of worship, or the whole theology of Christianity to begin with some of the values that are implemented here in America anyway, most of these bands that were coming out from the United States, clearly this generation was growing up with those values, and I do feel like that influence kind of weaved its way into some of the songwriting with these bands, both like lyrically and even terms of themes with their overall album artwork to their presentation. Another early example to this would be Under Oath, that formed back in 1997, a few years after Zao. Now, Under Oath today anyway is more in realms now of post-hardcore that isn't as heavy but their early releases, especially back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was a mixture between forms of metalcore, deathcore, and even to an extent death metal was kind of being flourished with their approach when they really started playing a bit faster. And when you look at their 1999 full-length album Acts of Desperation, for what it is considering it's metalcore and deathcore, it's pretty aggressive and rugged sounding. That again, its production value, just like Zao, is rough around the edges, but it's pretty intense for anyone trying to get into metalcore, I would state, showcasing again another band that was implementing Christianity lyrical themes into their approach. And just like with Zao, Under Oath album by album would kind of diminish some of their Christian themes in favor now for just, other ideas of like inner struggle, personal experiences, and stuff like that. But again, just like with Zao, their early albums was a strong presence of Christianity embedded into their lyrical themes. I will admit to you guys, when it comes to doing research for metalcore and deathcore bands, it's quite difficult considering the fact that, I'll be honest with you guys, the Metal Archives is a website I use quite a bit for doing research, comparing bands and stuff of that nature. And when it comes to the Metal Archives and metalcore and deathcore, they're not really too fond of allowing bands into that website. However, I did find an alternative that's basically the Metal Archives, but the Christian version of it, that being Heavy Christian Music. It's a website exactly like the Metal Archives that archives all bands that have to do themes with Christianity, and most of which is in this website are the metalcore and deathcore bands I couldn't come across on the Metal Archives. So shout out to this website. It's definitely worth checking out, as again, it archives all of these bands, and it even has tabs to the history of Christianity and how it was implemented with a lot of music scenes during the 60s up until present day. It's definitely a site worth checking out if you want a good history lesson all about this topic. But as I stated earlier on in this video, when it comes to the turn of the millennia, more Christian metalcore and deathcore bands were coming as those genres were starting to become trendy and hot. One of which of those bands would be Demon Hunter. Now, Demon Hunter plays pretty straightforward metalcore and deathcore adjacent styles of music with a little bit of a thrash metal edge when they play a little heavier, that it'll bounce between harsh vocals and clean vocals to kind of get into that more anthemic gospel-like kind of approach that they kind of go for musically. But what I've always found interesting about Demon Hunter with some of their releases from the 2000s is, while it does have like that worship aspect with it, as they are explicitly from their own personal views to their lyrical themes Christian metalcore, is that it always felt as if they were trying to appeal to a wider audience of the youth during that time, but also be like slightly more aggressive, as their name is Demon Hunter. Their symbol is a demon face with a bullet hole right between the eyes, showcasing, just like with bands like maybe Mortification, which I know is kind of a stretch, lyrically they're trying to be more of the upfront to battle against those demons. I mean, for God's sakes, one of their albums is titled Storm the Gates of Hell. But when it comes to Christian metalcore, Demon Hunter to me personally is like the face of it, or like one of the big names when it comes to this topic. Then you got As I Lay Dying, which I know nowadays are extremely controversial considering all the things that happened with Tim, but try to put your headspace now in the 2000s before all of this stuff, because what was interesting when I was getting into metalcore and deathcore back when I was in like middle school and starting high school, is that As I Lay Dying was always advertised as a Christian metalcore band. They would even state in interviews that they were Christian or they believed in that faith. And I know their album An Ocean Between Us, there's some songs on here where there's a strong Christian type of influence or references embedded within it. Particular songs on this album would be This Is Who We Are and Nothing Left, that have like a narrative going on with that faith. But other than that, I know as of recently, before the whole controversy happened with Timbaland Beast, I know they would end up admitting that it was all for show, just for commercial appeal, that way they can have a wider audience. As again, during the 2000s, Christianity being implemented with lyrical themes would help sell more records, I guess, to their audience. That this is where the confusion kind of lies now between with a lot of these metalcore and deathcore bands. Is it Christian metalcore where they believe in the faith and they'll showcase it on their music, or is it just an act with a lot of references, and this is where it kind of blurs the line now? Take for example Attack Attack with their debut full-length album Someday Came Suddenly. I know they're kind of viewed as a MySpace band of their time in the late 2000s, but believe it or not, when you listen to this album, at least lyrically, there's a lot of Christian undertones with its themes. Take for example their big hit, Stick Stickly. When you read into the choruses, there's a lot of verses that have to do with dealing with the presence of God. Though we may not know his intentions, we live for him by his overall worth, because he's worth it basically. It's basically like this weird, I don't know, Christian metalcore anthem that I don't think a lot of people interpreted as that, because visually, I mean, they're all wearing skinny jeans, they have their hair combed to the side, and they just kind of look like another scenecore band, if anything, that just does cliches of relationships and emotions. But no, the song Stick Stickly, if you look at its choruses, there's a lot of Christian references in it. To even on the same album with Someday Came Suddenly, there's a song called Catfish Soup. There's no reference to it, I guess. They just name these songs randomly for some reason. But in the chorus of this track, Catfish Soup, one of the vocalists says outright, "Hallelujah, I've been saved by grace." And that's the thing when it comes to bands like As I Lay Dying or Attack Attack, is you would look at these lyrical themes with the references that they would have, and you would think that they are a Christian metalcore band, when in reality they just use those references to write songs, or in this case with As I Lay Dying, they would downplay it to help sell records. But I remember growing up in the late 2000s getting into metalcore, and it seemed like any band that would just have the slightest reference to Christianity of any sort with a lyrical verse to even their song titles, by default they would be labeled as Christian metalcore. Examples of this from what I remember, bands like A Day to Remember, Asking Alexandria, and We Came as Romans were labeled under as Christian metalcore, when that just wasn't the case. Because of that confusion, I do believe it's a huge reason as to why all of the metalcore and deathcore bands that fundamentally believed in Christianity in their own personal lives, trying to implement that into their music, was really vocal to their audience, whether it be in terms of interviews to their live performances about their faith. Bands like August Burns Red, The Devil Wears Prada, Oh Sleeper, Fit for a King, For Today, War of Ages, Impending Doom, all of which and many others were really up front and center when it came to their faith, whether it be with their lyrical themes and overall presentation all the time. Whether or not these metalcore and deathcore bands at the height of their peak in terms of popularity and record sales would ever influence any other individuals to become Christian or not is something that I can't really determine. But what we do know is, in terms of the overall context of Christian metal music being showcased to the masses, it's without a shadow of a doubt, it really did peak for the metalcore and deathcore scene, as during the 2000s, even in the 2010s, when all of these bands I talked about and many others were releasing music, clearly a lot of people that were either teenagers or young adults were buying into it, as some of those bands ended up touring quite a lot, and even others like The Devil Wears Prada, for example, would end up touring on the Vans Warped Tour. So clearly records and attention for a younger audience was being showcased here. It's just whether or not they actually were influenced by their faith and message is still yet to really be determined. Most of these bands I've referenced thus far when it comes to metalcore and deathcore utilizing Christian themes is that they're still continuing on to this day. Most of them are still releasing music and touring, and while a handful of them have either kind of distanced themselves from showcasing their faith to an audience for more digestible themes that are like more relatable, or just still carrying over that sound and approach lyrically, they've kind of just become like their own niche little thing of what is considered to be like Christcore or Christian core in this case. But as it stands right now, they've all just kind of kept going, releasing music, and I don't really see any much of a popularity boost happening anytime soon. But it's just interesting that they found success during this time and they made their mark when it comes to anything that has to do with Christian heavy metal music. The only thing else I can add here when it comes to Christian metal bands is my personal favorite. It's just I didn't know where to really include them in this timeline, because they are debatably one of the most cutting edge metal bands I've come across just overall in music, that being Reverorum Ib Malacht. Now yes, you can call Reverorum Ib Malacht as avant-garde or experimental black metal, but really when you listen to them more and more and you've kept up with some of their releases, it just becomes all the more difficult to really characterize Reverorum Ib Malacht as just a black metal band that experiments, because they experiment so hard and go in all different directions that I'm just going to be honest with you guys, I don't know what to call them. I know they labeled themselves as Roman Catholic black metal, but even then, there's so many other forms of experimentation that black metal just seems to be one of the many components that they experiment with, that I've even seen them be labeled as power trance extreme metal or power trance black metal, because they utilize dark ambience, industrial, and all different forms of electronica and electronic music together, that what they're really trying to capture is, yes, themes of Christianity, but it's very transcending, like it's very spiritual. And I'm not just talking about lyrical themes, but just musically too, of how they experiment. It really feels like you're transcending to a whole different plane of existence, which I know it sounds like I'm overhyping them, but just listen to 3 different Reverorum Ib Malacht albums and they all sound vastly different. That if you're a fan of Bluthaus Nord but you want it to be even wilder, this project is for you. A great place to start off with Reverorum Ib Malacht is their 2018 full length that I cannot pronounce and I'm not going to butcher it. I'm pretty sure it's in Latin if memory serves me right. But one way I could describe it is, think of De Mysteriis Dom Satanis, but what if it was more spiritual? What if it was trying to, again, kind of enlighten you in a sense, but still capture that cryptic, harsh sound of black metal? Debatably, to me, this is probably their most digestible, but it still experiments quite a bit. But as I stated, if you want to go down a rabbit hole of just really wild experimentation that it just completely goes off the rails of what is conventional in black metal, I'll state it here once again, Reverorum Ib Malacht is absolutely for you. And if you're intrigued with Reverorum Ib Malacht as much as I am after listening to them, then I would strongly recommend immediately checking out Panegyrist. They've only released so far 1 full-length album back in 2018, but if memory serves me right, at least one of the members of Reverorum Ib Malacht is a part of this project, and it's more in vein of Deathspell Omega with some of the complexity with the guitar riffs, but they also utilize a lot of choruses that it kind of reminds me a bit of like Deathspell Omega's intensity meets some of the composition songwriting of Batushka going back and forth, while still adding in a lot of other bells and whistles and twists and turns that only the individuals of Reverorum Ib Malacht can pull off. So definitely check this out as well. Overall, for my closing remarks, there's really nothing that I can state here or showcase that's going to change anyone's mind about extreme metal. At the end of the day, all of the lyrical themes and how it's presented to its audience is really never going to change, as everything that is against the norms of Christianity, or everything that just isn't Christianity for extreme metal, will always be presented first more often than not. But I think it's a really interesting topic to bring up here, because it showcases a completely different side for metal music, regardless of the subgenre, from thrash, traditional, death, black metal, metalcore, deathcore, and whatever else have you, that people just really don't think about when it comes to metal music. And I just find this to be, again, this oxymoron, this parallel that a lot of people either ignore or just are unaware of, that's definitely worth a conversation. And I feel like most of what I talked about here is absolutely worth checking out. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, to the best of my ability, considering all the bands I talked about, I'll try to link some of the bands in the description below for you guys to listen to. Really curious to know what you think of Christian metal, any other Christian metal bands, regardless of subgenre, that should be discussed here, that you want to see be talked about. Definitely let me know in the comments. And other than that, like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.